It's great to be back. And I must say, whenever I come to a song with actions, there's a bit of a problem, I find. I can either sing or I can do actions. Being a male, I have never mastered the ability to do both simultaneously. So for all those similarly afflicted, you have my sympathy, and we make do, and we are glad to join with those who are multi-talented, multitask, wonderful singers. So, notice that the sermon title was Beautiful Devotion. I had a subtitle, The Last Battle Engaged. And it's both of those things are going to come out as we look through this passage in Mark chapter 14. For the very context of chapter 14, we now come to the last great battle between Jesus and his opponents. We're conscious of times like that. We're conscious of times when diplomacy and peace talks fail. We're conscious of times when the warplanes fly, the tanks roll and the armies march. We watch it all happen in real time on our TV screens. But back through the years, before it was so popularly displayed, it still happened. There were times that you get to when there are two opposing sides and there is no possibility of compromise, no time of escape, no time of last-minute negotiation. The battle lines are drawn and the battle begins. And that's what we have in Mark chapter 14. For the context of this chapter and then on for the rest of Mark's Gospel is that the enemies of Jesus have engaged with him in conversation, in questioning, in all manner of interaction. And we've seen Jesus in responding and becoming more and more clear that there is an opposition that they have towards him, but that God has towards them. And so the battle begins as we lead into the time of Jesus' crucifixion and then resurrection. I want to look at three different sets of people here in this account from Mark's Gospel that will help us understand this conflict and see through the conflict as to where it might be leading. First people to look at, we meet are the chief priests and teachers of the law in the first couple of verses of Mark chapter 14. The time's getting very close. 2 days' time, Jesus is going to be crucified. It is very close to the end. And as I said, these battle lines are drawn. A decision has already been made by these chief priests and teachers of the law, the sort of clergy and lay people of the Jewish nation, as they have joined together and they have decided to scheme to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. It's not a question of, they're not debating, should we do this? That is, kill him. They've decided that. We must get rid of this one with his preposterous, blasphemous claims to be the Messiah and even more, to be God with us. We have to get rid of such a one. The only question for them is, how can we do it? Because they were scheming to arrest him secretly. They were aware that there was a problem. Not during the festival, they said, or people may riot. They were afraid of what might happen if they did it in such a way that it became known. There was a time of great religious fervour at the time of the Passover as it was celebrated in Jerusalem. The population of Jerusalem increased 5 times during such a feast, and people were at tiptoe expectancy about what might happen. That happened every Passover. It was given a very sharp focus this Passover because Jesus had been popularly acclaimed as he'd come into Jerusalem. And the people who knows what might happen, and if there was a riot, then the very lives of the chief priests and teachers of the law would be under threat. If there was a riot in Jerusalem, the Roman overlords took very unkindly to such things happening in the Pax Romana, the peace that Rome enforced on the whole world. To have a riot that was seen as opposition to the emperor's rule of peace and quiet, that's what you do as a subjected people. You act in quietness and saying, yes, sir. If that is challenged in any way, the Roman army would have had no problems at all in destroying not just the chief priests and the teachers of the law and Jesus and his disciples, anybody else that got in their way. You only have to think through to 70 AD when the temple was razed to the ground under the Roman general Titus to know how they treated people like that. So the chief priests and teachers of the law know they can't cause a riot. How are they going to arrest Jesus and get him killed without the people knowing? That was their problem. Their solution was, well, we won't do it during the festival. We can't do it then. We might be an opportune later. However, they have an unexpected ally that's going to change all their plans. And so we move on to the next person or group of people. We move from verse 2 to verse 3, where Mark takes us back to something that happened a little earlier in this week. Actually, 6 days before the festival, 4 days before this. Steve and I were having a debate about when this possibly could. I've spent the hour or so in between services thinking that it was probably the Saturday night, just after the Passover, the Sabbath day had ended. I think it's probably the Saturday night before that. I could be entirely wrong. That's been known, that has happened. Back in 1952, I think there was hard to get the dating exactly right, but it was before these events in the chief priests. It's back in Bethany a few days before. Bethany is a town on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, not far from Jerusalem. You go up from Bethany through Bethphage and down from the Mount of Olives and into Jerusalem itself. But here we have an event happening a few days before in the home of Simon the leper. We can only presume he was no longer afflicted with leprosy, or they wouldn't have been able to be in his house. But presumably he was a man who had been healed of his leprosy. Simon the leper, that's how you know him. He's the one who was healed. And it may even be that Jesus was the one who healed Simon. We don't know, but we do know that the feast was given in his honour. Now, we know this happened beforehand and it was being given in his honour. We know a bit more about this gathering because we read in John chapter 12 where we get some more of these details. Simon the leper, his home, maybe a feast, well, it was a feast given in Jesus' honour. Bethany is the place where he'd raised Lazarus. Bethany was the place where he'd done those miracles. He was amongst people who were his people. And as he's there, sitting there, Mark tells us a woman came up and anointed him with a very expensive jar of oil. It was worth more than a year's wages. And the response by the people there, what a waste. What a waste. It was this material, I'm told, just by reading, that I don't have any expert knowledge of nard, I've got to say, but I read that it was a very thick liquid, came from an Egyptian tree, and people had it in little jars. But you could only get at it really, well, the jar had a thin neck on it, presumably because it was so expensive, you doled it out in very small drops through the neck. However, in this case, the woman pours it all over Jesus. It would have been snapping off the neck of the jar and tipping the jar and its contents all over Jesus. It was a one-off event. It was a giving of this woman probably of her most treasured possession, something that was very precious in terms of money, but precious probably because of its the fact that it was perfume and that it was so well liked. Harsh words, though. What a waste. In Mark's Gospel here, he says it was those present. Why this waste? If we read Matthew, we find out that it was the disciples who are saying, what a waste. And if we read John's Gospel, we find that the spokesperson for the disciples is none other than Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, who presumably he's speaking on behalf of the disciples. What a waste to have this expensive perfume just used up in all one go like this. Hard to know exactly why Judas is driven to do this. In John's Gospel, he says Judas was a thief. And not just on this occasion, it was common practice to take some of the monies, for what purpose we don't know, but to steal from the common purposes. Others have wondered whether he might have been driven by a desire to force Jesus to declare that he was a rebel opposed to all the Roman overlords. There may have been a measure of disappointment there. We don't know. Judas may well be one of those people for whom the end justifies the means, that he gathers the money, that he wants to make Jesus live out what he thinks he ought to do. His surname is very interesting, Iscariot. May identify him with a group of people who were rebels against the Romans. Maybe his rebellion. Whatever it was, it led him to say, I want to provide the Jewish leaders with a way of getting rid of Jesus. If our eyes go across to verse 10 and 11, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. Mark says they were delighted to hear this. I think that's a bit of understatement, really. They thought all their Christmases had come at once. I used the word Christmas wrongly there, of course, but they thought if only they had seen that all their Christmases had come at once, because here was the way they could get to Jesus without causing a riot. He would lead them to the place where they could arrest Jesus and take him away. And what did they give? They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. I always thought that the money was substantial. How much was it? Do you remember? 30 pieces of silver. I thought in my younger days I could do with 30 pieces of silver, and thought it was, that they were bribing Judas with a lot. Then I've read back in Exodus chapter 21 verse 32 says that if you happen to own a bull who gets out and accidentally attacks a neighbour's slave and gnaws them to death, you have to recompense the owner of the slave. Do you know what a slave is worth? 30 pieces of silver. That's what Exodus chapter 21, that's what Jesus was worth. The amount that you would give to the slave of another person who was accidentally killed by your bull. Jesus is betrayed in a sordid deal that puts no value on his life. So I've seen the chief priests and the teachers of the law. We've seen Judas and his betrayal. But we now look at Mary and her devotion, because we know who this woman was. Mark leaves her unnamed. John names her. She is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. We read about Jesus' interaction with Mary a couple of times in the Gospel of John. On 2 occasions, she is severely criticised. The first occasion, Jesus was there visiting the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. Lazarus, you'll remember that Jesus restored to life after he had died. And Mary, on another occasion, Mary and Martha are there, and Jesus comes, and Martha wants to organise the house and get ready for Jesus and his disciples. There would have been perhaps a group of 20 plus number of people. You've got to get your food ready. You've got to get the house ready. Everything has to be done. And what is Mary doing while Martha's doing all that? She's sitting down listening to what Jesus is saying. We can understand Martha. She goes up and says, "Lord, tell Mary to give us a hand." And big sisters are a bit like that. I'm assuming Martha was the big sister, but big sisters are a bit like that, wanting to organise their younger sisters, and why aren't they doing what they're meant to be doing? Dad, Mum, they haven't tidied the room, and you told them to do that a long time ago. So Mary is being criticised by Martha. Now Mary's here being criticised once again, but this time by very harsh words. What a waste. Why haven't this been sold? And if you want to get rid of it, sell it, give it to the poor. At the Passover time, the poor are always meant to be helped. You could have done that in a great sense of giving to the poor. What a waste. And who are her critics? The disciples, people that she would have looked to as the followers of Jesus. And so she's come under this heavy criticism at least twice, except she has one who stands with her. And Jesus says, what she is doing is right. Martha, the best thing to do is to listen to me and my words. The best thing to do. This is no waste. This is her response of love towards me in preparation for my burial. It's the exact opposite of waste. Sometimes we don't like it when people waste things. I can well remember I was in a parish in the 80s, early 80s, and I had a visit. A man who was one of my wardens came to see me, and he wanted me to do something. His son had been collecting for years a collection of coins. It was worth about $500, so it was a fairly substantial collection of coins. And he had been reading the Bible and he'd been listening to sermons and going to Bible studies. He decided to sell up this collection of coins and give the money to things that were happening. I forget whether it was the church or in mission, but he wanted to do that as something that he would give generously. His father, the church warden, wanted me to talk him out of it. What a waste that he should just take all his collection and sell it up like that. We can understand the criticism of Mary, but for Jesus, it is the exact opposite. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. He'd told them so many times that he was going to be betrayed and put to death, but it hadn't sunk through. But he sees, can you see in this response of love and devotion the preparation for what I'm going to go through, my death, on your behalf, so that you might live. And we know that it's not just the burial, but he even gives us a hint that it goes on beyond. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. There is going to be an ongoing gospel wherever, throughout the world, shows us that here is not the devotion towards a dead hero, but a living Saviour. For the message of Jesus, well, that is the gospel, Jesus says is going to go on, and her response of love is what is going to mark her out and mark this account out. It's a wonderful account of that response of love. For love is the great motivator. People talk about the love of country that has brought them to acts of sacrifice, the love of family that has meant that people have acted out of with no concern for themselves but for others. The love of others. It's the language of sacrifice. What shall I do for those whom I love? Whether as parent, child, country, whatever. Now, sometimes that's led to the greatest acts of devotion and love. Sometimes the person or the cause has not been worthy of such an act of devotion. But here is Jesus saying that love for me is going to be told. For Mary's response, she recognises the worth of Jesus. This is not just any cause. Here is one who is worthy of such love and devotion. And we could unpack that for the next day or 3 or 100, thinking about the way in which Jesus' death and resurrection has opened the possibility of life for us. And what is our response to one who has done that? He is worthy of our love and our devotion. And I want to talk here about our response, not just of our head to saying, I think it true, not just even of a manner of life, I ought to do this, I ought to do that, but one that stems from our very inmost being to say, what characterises my life is that I love Jesus. A friend of mine told me about an experience he had. He was sitting in a restaurant when another person came in, a person we both know, and called out across the restaurant using his name, "Do you still love Jesus?" Well, I guess I wouldn't go into a restaurant and yell that out. That's just my conservative nature, perhaps. But it's the question we ought to ask one another, isn't it? It's the only thing that matters. Do you still love Jesus? I'm not asking about what you're doing, even what your ministries are. I'm not asking about all the good things you are doing. I'm asking, do you still love Jesus? As I have to ask myself, do I still love Jesus? I love preaching. That's not the same as loving Jesus. I love doing whole heaps of things. It's not the same as loving Jesus. That's the question that we ask one another, as Jesus pointed out what Mary did, this looking of a waste, this overflowing response of love towards Jesus sets the pattern as to be told of her down through the ages, and then challenges us to say, what is my response to one who has loved me without stint, who has loved me to the very uttermost of his being and has provided every opportunity for my future? Do I still love Jesus?